David sat quietly at the corner table near the window, his phone resting on the table beside the menu he'd already memorized. The faint sound of silverware clinking and low jazz music mixed with the aroma of roasted vegetables and freshly baked bread. He wore a navy blue sweater, his hands clasped neatly in front of him as he waited for his food. It was just another ordinary evening, or so he thought. The restaurant wasn't particularly busy. Maybe 5 or 6 other tables were occupied, but it felt warm and cozy. For a moment, David felt almost at peace, his eyes drifting lazily to the golden light fixtures that hung like stars from the ceiling. Then came the sudden shadow over his table. He looked up to see a woman, white, in her late 20s perhaps, wearing a burgundy apron with a name tag that read Claire. She didn't smile. Her face was tight, like someone who had just bitten into something sour. She didn't greet him. She didn't ask if everything was okay. She didn't even check to see if he needed water. Instead, she stood with arms crossed and said flatly, "You need to leave." David blinked, thinking maybe he misheard. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm, uncertain. Claire didn't move, didn't blink. "I said, you need to leave. Now." There was no anger in her voice, but there was something even more cutting: indifference. It wasn't a request, and it wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a command. David's hands slowly lifted off the table, palms facing upward as if to physically catch the confusion in the air. "Why? I just ordered. I haven't even gotten my food yet." Claire's expression didn't soften. In fact, it hardened. "We don't serve people like you here," she said, her voice now louder, sharp enough for the nearby tables to catch pieces of it. "So I'm asking you to leave before we call security." The room didn't freeze, not entirely. A couple looked over briefly and then turned away, suddenly very interested in their appetizers. A man sipping coffee stared down at his phone, as if it had just turned into the Holy Grail. David sat back in his chair, trying to process what he had just heard. "People like me," he repeated, his voice a low rumble of disbelief. Claire didn't waver. "You heard me." And then, as if to punctuate her statement, she turned slightly to the side and scanned the room with a bored expression, like she had somewhere better to be. David's heart started to race, not from fear, but from a deep, rising disbelief that burned hotter by the second. He hadn't done anything wrong. He hadn't raised his voice, hadn't caused a scene. He had come in, sat down, ordered food like any other person in that restaurant. "So, let me get this straight," he said slowly, forcing his voice to stay even. "You're kicking me out because I'm black." That made her look at him again, this time with a flicker of annoyance. "Sir, I'm asking you to leave. If you don't leave, I'll have to get the manager." "Get them," David said, his voice steady now, his eyes locked on hers. "Please, let's do that." But Claire didn't move. "Look," she said, lowering her voice like she was suddenly trying to pretend to be the reasonable one. "This isn't the kind of place where you can just walk in and expect to be served. We have standards. I'm dressed fine. I've been polite. I've ordered and paid. What exactly is your standard?" David asked. "Skin color." Claire's lips pressed into a line. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked away toward the kitchen, leaving David sitting there with his pulse pounding in his ears. He could feel eyes on him, the weight of glances that vanished the moment he turned his head. No one said anything. No one asked if he was okay. The world around him kept chewing, sipping, and avoiding. A moment later, Claire returned, this time with a man in a white shirt and tie, probably the manager. He looked nervous already. "Sir," he began, "I understand there's been a... Are you really about to finish that sentence?" David cut in. "Because if you're here to support what just happened, I need you to say it to my face." The manager hesitated, then glanced at Claire, who stood just behind him with her arms crossed again like a guard dog waiting for her leash to be pulled. "I'm just trying to keep things calm," he said weakly. "Calm." David laughed, not loudly, but the sound was dry, humorless. "Your employee just told me to leave, because I'm black, and you're worried about calm." Claire jumped in. "I never said that exactly. You said you don't serve people like me. Don't backpedal now." David's voice was rising, but not in anger, in clarity. The restaurant wasn't loud, and he knew his words were carrying. That was the point now. "Look, sir," the manager said, raising both hands slightly, like he was handling an unstable situation. "We're going to refund your money, and I think it's best if you just go." "No," David said flatly. "Not until we talk about what really just happened here." Claire scoffed. "You're making this a bigger deal than it is. The second you opened your mouth and decided to treat me like a second-class citizen, it became a big deal." David's hands were trembling slightly now, not out of weakness, but from the sheer effort it was taking not to explode. He pulled out his phone and tapped the camera app. "You want calm? Let's get the truth on record." The manager took a step back. "Please don't film." Too late. David hit the record button and held the phone up, catching both of them in the frame. "Tell me again why I was told to leave." Neither of them spoke. The silence stretched. David let it hang in the air, let the discomfort soak into the cracks of their composure. Then he lowered the phone. "I want my refund. Now. And I want your names." Claire turned on her heel and walked away again, her face red with embarrassment or rage. It was hard to tell which. The manager hesitated a moment longer, before nodding quickly and muttering, "I'll get your money." David stayed seated. He could have stormed out. He could have yelled. But this wasn't about making a scene. This was about making sure people, like Claire, understood something they clearly never had to before, that the days of silent submission were long gone. The room still avoided him, but now there was something else in the air, something shifting. He could feel it, and he wasn't going anywhere. David remained frozen in his seat, the hum of conversations and clinking glasses around him now a dull, distant buzz in the back of his mind. His fingers were cold, even though the restaurant was comfortably warm, and his chest felt tight, like the air had become too thick to breathe properly. He couldn't believe what had just come out of her mouth. He couldn't believe that in 2025, in the middle of a city like this, someone could say something so vile, so open, so unapologetically racist without even flinching. "We don't serve NS here." The words echoed, not just in his ears but in his skull, bouncing around his mind like a cruel joke that refused to fade. He sat there, staring at Claire's back as she walked away, like what she'd said was just another routine part of her shift, like she'd told someone they were out of soup or that their table wasn't ready yet. But this wasn't routine. This was violence. David's jaw tightened. His heart pounded, not from fear, but from a raw, stunned fury that crept up his spine like fire. He slowly stood up from the table, eyes scanning the room, looking for someone, anyone, who might have heard what she said. But no one met his gaze. Some looked away quickly. Others pretended to be busy with their food. It was the kind of silence that screamed complicity. The manager was gone now, back behind the swinging door to the kitchen, and Claire had vanished toward the counter, typing something into the computer like nothing had happened. David walked over, his steps slow but deliberate, his voice low but firm. "I want a refund. Now." Claire didn't look up. "You'll get nothing. You were asked to leave. You didn't follow the rules." David blinked. "What rules? What rule says I have to leave because of the color of my skin?" She finally met his eyes again, this time with a look of smug control. "You were disturbing the peace. We reserve the right to refuse service." "I wasn't disturbing anything. I sat, I ordered, I waited. That's all I did." Her lips curled into a smirk. Then maybe you should have picked a different place. This isn't your kind of restaurant. My kind, David repeated, louder now, and a couple nearby diners paused mid-bite. You mean black? Just say it again. Go on. You heard me the first time, she snapped. We don't serve NS here. And there it was again, that same slur, venomous, tossed like trash at his feet. His body tensed. He wasn't going to let it slide. Not this time. Not ever. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and with steady fingers dialed 911. The ring only lasted a second before the operator picked up, and David kept his voice as composed as possible, though every word trembled with restrained emotion. Yes, I'm at Lorenzo's on Main Street. I was just refused service and told to leave because of my race. I'd like an officer to come down and help sort this out. The operator took his name and details, promised someone would be dispatched shortly, and David hung up, then turned back to the counter. Claire looked amused now. Oh, so you're calling the cops now? What, you think they'll care? They'll care, David said through gritted teeth. And even if they don't, there'll be a record of this. And I recorded you too. That video's already backed up. You messed with the wrong person. Her smirk faltered just slightly, but she didn't reply. She simply turned and walked into the kitchen again, leaving David standing by the counter, the murmurs around him growing slightly louder now as people began to realize something was happening. Some whispered, others looked visibly uncomfortable. Still, no one said anything to him. 10 minutes passed, then 15. David didn't move. He stood there like a statue, arms crossed, phone still in hand. And then, finally, red and blue lights flickered through the restaurant's front windows. A patrol car pulled up outside, and moments later, 2 officers walked in, one male, one female, both in their late 30s, wearing blank professional expressions. David raised his hand slightly to identify himself, and they walked over. Mr. David Anderson? The male officer asked. David nodded. Yes. Thank you for coming. I've got a video on my phone I'd like you to see. The officer nodded, and David pulled up the recording, hitting play. Claire's voice echoed from the tiny speaker. Clear. Unmistakable. The words hit like hammers, again and again. Impossible to deny. The officers exchanged glances. The female officer's mouth twitched like she wanted to say something, but was holding back. Can you point out the employee? The male officer asked. David gestured toward the back. She's in the kitchen now. Her name's Claire. The officer nodded and walked over to the kitchen door, pushing it open and disappearing inside with his partner. A few minutes later, they returned with the manager in tow, his face pale and sweaty. Claire followed behind, arms crossed, eyes rolling. The officer motioned for them to stop near the front counter. Mr. Anderson, would you like to repeat what happened? David recounted everything, from the moment he sat down to the moment she used that word, twice. The officers listened quietly. When he finished, the male officer turned to the manager. Is there any reason this gentleman was refused service? The manager stuttered. We have a policy of reserving the right. That's not what I asked, the officer interrupted. Was there any legitimate reason other than his race? The manager hesitated, then shook his head. Claire huffed. This is ridiculous. The female officer turned to her. Ma'am, do you deny using a racial slur toward the customer? Claire scoffed. So what if I did? It's not illegal to have an opinion. You were acting in your capacity as a representative of this establishment, the officer replied. That changes everything. This isn't just your opinion. It's your employer's conduct. The male officer turned to David again. Would you like to press charges or file a report? David took a deep breath. I want a full refund. I want an apology. And I want this on record. I want it known that this restaurant allows this kind of behavior. The manager's voice cracked as he said, Of course. Of course. We'll refund you immediately. I'm so sorry, sir, truly. This was unacceptable. You're damn right it was, David said. The manager disappeared into the back and came back with a small envelope of cash and the receipt. Here. And again, I apologize. We'll take internal disciplinary action. David took the refund but didn't thank him. Claire stood there, still defiant, but now looking a little less sure of herself. The officers told the manager they'd be filing a report and would be following up. As the officers stepped away, the male one paused and said, "I've seen a lot of things, but what she said, that was straight hate. You did the right thing standing your ground." David gave a faint nod, his body still buzzing with disbelief. He turned and walked toward the door. The room was quiet now, eerily so. The same people who had looked away when he was first approached now looked directly at him, but with guilt, shame, or maybe just curiosity. He didn't care. He pushed the door open and stepped outside into the cool evening air, his lungs finally filling fully for the first time in what felt like hours. As he walked down the sidewalk, the city lights flickering in the distance, his mind was still racing. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't wanted it, but it had happened, and he'd faced it, head on. David stood outside the restaurant for several minutes after the police left, the cash refund still clenched in his hand, the cool air brushing against his skin like a quiet reassurance that he had made it through something ugly but necessary. The street was alive with cars and voices, but inside him, everything felt muted. His emotions swirled anger, disbelief, relief, exhaustion, and yet a fire still burned somewhere deep inside. He hadn't just stood up for himself. He had drawn a line in the sand. The officers hadn't hesitated to believe him, and that mattered more than he'd expected. In the past, he'd seen it go the other way. Too many times, but not today. Today, the law had sided with the truth. As he walked home, he couldn't stop thinking about the final words the officer had said before leaving. "This isn't over. They're going to be investigated. You did the right thing." Those words echoed louder than the slur that had started all of this. By the time David reached his apartment, the adrenaline had worn off, and the weight of the evening came crashing down on him like a wave. He sat on his couch in silence, staring at the small paper bag that held the cash. He didn't even want the money. It wasn't about that. It was about respect, dignity. He pulled out his phone and opened the video he had recorded earlier, watching Claire's face as she uttered those words with zero shame. He could barely believe it had really happened, but it had, and now he had proof. Online, he found the restaurant's website, and to his surprise, there was already a storm brewing. Someone must have posted about the incident, because reviews were flooding in 1-star ratings, angry comments, people demanding accountability. The video hadn't even gone viral yet, but word of mouth was spreading fast. David didn't post it publicly, not yet, but he sent it to a few friends, some community leaders, and a lawyer friend who said he'd look into civil rights complaints. The night was long, and sleep was short. He woke up the next morning to dozens of messages. Some from friends offering support, some from strangers who had seen a copy of the video. Some were even from news reporters asking for interviews. But what shocked him most was a voicemail from the restaurant manager. "Mr. Anderson, this is Tom, the general manager at Lorenzo's. I want to sincerely apologize again. I understand we failed you last night, and I take full responsibility. Claire has been suspended pending an internal review. If you'd be willing to talk, we'd like to offer a formal apology and make things right." David stared at his phone, unsure how to respond. Part of him wanted to forget the whole thing, to move on. But another part, the stronger, louder part, knew that if he backed down now it would send the wrong message. That you could just say sorry and brush racism under the rug. So later that day, he called back. Tom picked up on the first ring. "Mr. Anderson, thank you for calling me back. I truly appreciate it. I'm not calling for appreciation, David said flatly. I'm calling because you asked to make things right. So, tell me what that looks like to you. Tom's voice faltered for a moment, but then steadied. We'd like to invite you back to the restaurant. I know it's a lot to ask, but we want to apologize in person. The staff, who were present last night, will be there. No cameras, just a sincere apology, a free meal if you're comfortable, and a promise to make serious changes. David didn't respond right away. You understand this doesn't erase what happened. Of course, Tom said quickly, but we hope it can be a step forward. After a long pause, David agreed. I'll come, but if anything feels off, I'm walking out. Understood. Completely, Tom said. 2 days later, David returned to Lorenzo's. He stood outside the same door where he'd been humiliated, took a deep breath, and pushed it open. The restaurant was quieter than usual. No crowds, no bustle, just a few employees behind the counter, all of whom turned when they saw him. Tom approached immediately, his face lined with remorse. Mr. Anderson, thank you again for coming. David nodded, but said nothing. Tom gestured to a reserved table near the front window. Please. David sat, watching the staff closely. None of them looked smug now. Claire was nowhere in sight. Tom cleared his throat. Before anything else, I want to say how deeply sorry we are. What happened was unacceptable on every level. We've already begun diversity and anti-bias training for the entire staff. Claire has been terminated as of this morning. This restaurant was built to serve everyone, and we failed you. We're ashamed of that. Another staff member stepped forward, a young woman who had been behind the counter the other night, but hadn't said a word. I wanted to say I'm sorry too, she said, her voice shaking slightly. I should have spoken up. I was scared. But that's not an excuse. I saw what happened, and it was wrong. David looked at her, then at the others. For the first time, they looked human, flawed, but perhaps learning. He let the silence hang for a few moments before finally speaking. What she said didn't just hurt me. It reminded me of every time I've been followed in a store, every time someone crossed the street when they saw me coming. It reminded me that no matter how well I dress or how polite I am, some people will only see my skin. The room was quiet. A heaviness filled the space, but it wasn't the same as before. It was heavier in a necessary way. You can't undo what happened, David continued, but you can learn from it, and you can teach others not to repeat it. Tom nodded solemnly. We intend to. We're making it part of our onboarding, every new hire, and we've made a donation to a local civil rights organization in your name. That part caught David off guard. Really? Yes. It felt like the least we could do. A waitress quietly brought over a meal, David's original order from the other night, now hot and fresh and neatly plated. It's on the house, she said gently. We understand if you don't want to eat it, but we wanted to try. David looked down at the food. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he could eat a single bite, but then he picked up the fork slowly and took one. It was good. Just food. Nothing more, nothing less. But in this context, it meant something else. Thank you, he said quietly. After the meal, Tom offered to walk him out. As they reached the door, Tom said, We know we've got a long way to go, but thanks to you, we're taking the first step. David paused before leaving. Then make sure it's not the last step. It won't be. As David stepped back into the sunlight, he felt lighter than before. Not because everything was okay now. It wasn't, but because he hadn't let it go unanswered. He had stood up, spoken out, and forced a place that tried to exclude him to reckon with its ugliness. He didn't know if he'd ever come back to Lorenzo's again. Maybe he would, maybe not. But one thing was clear. The next time someone who looked like him walked through those doors, they wouldn't be treated the same way. And that mattered. That changed something. and for now, that was enough. A few days had passed since that uneasy but important meeting at Lorenzo's, and David found himself once again walking along the same street, past the same storefronts, toward the same restaurant whose name now carried an entirely different weight in his mind. He hadn't planned on going back, not so soon at least, but something in him told him that unfinished moments linger until you face them again, and today he didn't want to feel like a guest in his own community anymore. He wanted to walk through those doors on his own terms, as a customer, as a man, as someone who had every right to sit, eat, and be served with the same dignity afforded to anyone else. As he approached the glass door, he hesitated for only a second before pulling it open. The familiar bell chimed overhead, and this time, instead of the icy silence or hostile stares, he was met with warm, if slightly cautious, nods from the staff. A new hostess stood at the podium, young, nervous, but clearly briefed on who he was. Her eyes widened a bit before she caught herself and smiled. "Good afternoon. Sir, welcome to Lorenzo's. Table for one." David gave her a polite nod. "Yes, please." She grabbed a menu and led him to a booth near the window, the same one he had sat at on that first fateful night. As he slid into the seat, he could feel eyes on him. Some curious, some concerned, but not hostile. Not this time. Moments later, Tom, the general manager, emerged from the back, spotting David instantly. His expression was one of earnest gratitude, and maybe even a little relief. He crossed the room quickly. "Mr. Anderson, David, it's good to see you again. I wasn't sure if we'd have the honor." David looked up, his voice steady. "I wasn't sure if I'd come." Tom nodded slowly. "Understandable. Truly. But we're glad you did. I meant what I said the other day. We're making changes. And I want you to know that your presence here is important. Not just for us, but for everyone who walks in after you." David didn't say anything at first, just looked around the room. There were new posters on the wall, small but visible signs about inclusivity, zero tolerance for discrimination, a number to call for concerns. Not a fix, but something. The waitress who came to his table was unfamiliar. She smiled genuinely and introduced herself. "Hi, I'm Mariah. I'll be taking care of you today. And before I say anything else, I just want to personally apologize for what happened here before. We're better than that, and we're working every day to prove it." David looked her in the eye and nodded once. "Thank you." She handed him a menu, but when he reached for it, she held up her hand. "Just so you know, today your meal's on us. Anything you want. No charge. That's from management, and honestly, from all of us." David blinked. "You don't have to do that." "We know," she replied, "but we want to." He scanned the menu anyway, not out of need but habit, eventually settling on the same meal he had ordered the night of the incident. It felt symbolic somehow, a way of reclaiming that moment, reshaping it. While he waited, he noticed customers coming and going, some casting glances his way, some not. Two older black women walked in, and one of them recognized him. She gave him a subtle nod, not of fame, not of celebrity, but of respect. An acknowledgement. It meant more to him than he could explain. As his food arrived, beautifully presented and steaming hot, Tom came back to the table. "I won't bother you long, but I wanted to tell you one more thing. Since your visit, we've had other guests speak up about small things, quiet biases, subtle slights, and we've taken all of it seriously. This isn't just about what happened to you. You opened our eyes to a much bigger picture." David appreciated the honesty. He picked up his fork and took a bite. The meal was perfect, somehow even better than he remembered, or maybe it was just the context that made it taste different. "I hope you keep that up," he said between bites. "Don't let this be a one-time performance." "We won't," Tom promised. "We're working with a community board now. Monthly reviews, open forums. We want to be accountable. For the first time, David let himself smile a little. That's good. Tom gave a small bow of his head and walked away, giving David space to enjoy his food. The atmosphere in the restaurant was calm, respectful, maybe even healing in its own way. No cameras, no performance. Just a man having lunch, surrounded by people who finally saw him as a person instead of a problem. Halfway through his meal, Mariah returned with a small dessert plate. "Compliments of the kitchen," she said. "Sweet potato pie. One of our new specials." David laughed lightly. "You're spoiling me now." "You deserve it," she said sincerely. "You really do." As he finished his lunch, sipping the last of his drink, he leaned back in the booth and let the moment wash over him. He had come in expecting tension, perhaps awkwardness. What he got instead was a strange sense of peace. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But progress. A shift. When he finally stood to leave, several of the staff members offered him goodbyes. The hostess gave a soft, "Thank you for coming." Outside, the sun was warm, and the city hummed with its usual rhythm. David walked down the street with a steadier stride. He wasn't naive. He knew racism didn't die in a week, in a meal, in an apology. But he also knew this. Silence changes nothing, and confrontation, uncomfortable as it is, can plant the seeds of change. Back at home, he opened his messages and saw another flood of notifications. More people asking for interviews, groups requesting him to speak, even students from a local college wanting to hear his story for a racial justice panel. He hadn't meant to become a voice, but now that he had one, he wasn't going to waste it. But for today, for this one day, he let himself be still. He closed his eyes, thought about how the food had tasted, how Mariah had looked him in the eye without fear or judgment, how Tom's voice had wavered with sincerity. Maybe small wins like this weren't flashy. Maybe they didn't go viral, but they mattered, and they added up. David wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot, but now he knew change was possible. And sometimes it started with walking back into the same place that tried to break you and showing them you're still standing, still hungry, still here,